A girl stayed home alone for a short period of time and disappeared without a trace. What happened next felt more like a detective thriller than a real case, because it was impossible to believe that something like that could have happened in real life. It took 15 years to finally learn the truth, and when it happened, everyone was enraged and shocked. Jessica Dishon was born on May 2, 1982, in the small American town of Shepherdsville, Kentucky. It was a quiet place where a lot of residents were involved in farming and knew each other well. Jessica had 2 younger brothers, and from an early age, she helped her parents to take care of the kids while they were working. This made Jessica more independent, and her parents could always rely on her. When she was 15, she took a part-time job at a local restaurant to save up for her first car she dreamed of, a red Pontiac. And a few years later, she had saved enough money to make that dream a reality. Despite her part-time job, Jessica had excellent grades and started to make plans to attend college to become an accountant after school. In the fall of 1999, when she was 17, Jessica entered her senior year. She also started dating a boy and was thrilled about it. On the morning of Friday, September 10th, her day began as usual. Jessica's parents left for work while she was still asleep. Her younger brothers went to the bus stop and left for school. Jessica stayed home and was supposed to drive to school in her car soon after her brothers. Somewhere around noon, her mother returned home and immediately noticed something weird. Jessica's car was parked in front of the house, although she should have been in class at that time. The mother entered the house and went to her daughter's room. Her initial thought was that Jessica might have overslept and missed school, but she wasn't in her bedroom. Next, the mother thought that, for some reason, Jessica might have asked her father for a ride to school. She called him, but he said he had gone to work alone that morning. Thinking there might be something wrong with Jessica's car, the mother took a spare key from the house to try starting it. However, as soon as she approached the car, she saw a disturbing scene. Firstly, the driver's door was slightly open. Secondly, and more alarming, Jessica's cell phone lay on the seat with the numbers 9 and 1 on the screen. Beneath the front seat lay one of Jessica's shoes and her keys, and in the back seat were her textbooks, work clothes, and purse. The mother immediately feared the worst. It was evident that someone had tried to dial 911 on Jessica's phone, but didn't finish it. Moreover, Jessica obviously couldn't have just left all her belongings in the car and walked away. The family lived on the outskirts of town, so she would have had to cover several miles along the road on foot. Jessica's parents called the school, only to hear that their daughter hadn't attended class. Somehow, the school had failed to notify them about this, as it should have done. A few hours later, Jessica's best friend from the restaurant where they both worked called her parents, saying that Jessica hadn't shown up for her shift, increasing their concern. Concerned about Jessica's absence from school and work and the fact that her belongings, including a phone with 9 and 1 dialed, were left in an unlocked car, her parents decided to call the police. However, the sheriff simply suggested that Jessica likely wandered off and would return home eventually. He didn't even pay any attention to the fact that one of her shoes was left in the car, making it difficult for her to go far without it. Jessica's parents tried to convince the sheriff that their daughter might be in danger, but despite their pleas, he refused to open an investigation, leaving them with no choice but to return home. After that, Jessica's parents decided to take matters into their own hands. They contacted relatives, friends, and acquaintances, but no one had seen her. Together, they started to search for Jessica throughout the town, but she was nowhere to be seen. The next morning, her parents went back to the sheriff and told him that Jessica still didn't make it home. This time, he dispatched 2 officers to inspect her car. But their parents faced yet another problem. The officers examined the vehicle without gloves, touching everything inside with their bare hands. They also didn't check Jessica's room, although it was standard procedure. Once again let down by law enforcement, Jessica's parents tried to get some help from the local media, drawing their attention to their daughter's disappearance and the police's lack of interest. Alongside relatives and friends, they initiated their own search and also began distributing flyers with information about Jessica. The search was led by Jessica's father and his brother, Stanley, who knew the area well. Fearing the worst, they decided to search the vicinity near a local river. The area had a pretty bad reputation as it was popular among local drug dealers and other criminals due to its overgrown and secluded nature. For hours, Jessica's relatives combed through the difficult terrain near the river but found no trace of her. The next morning, something extremely weird happened. Jessica's parents were at home and their son was playing in the yard. Suddenly, he rushed inside, claiming he heard a cry for help that sounded like his sister's voice. Jessica's father grabbed his shotgun and rushed outside, trying to locate the source of the cry. At the same time, his brother drove up to their house and quickly joined the search. Soon, they noticed something. There was a smoke rising from their neighbor's property. A 40-year-old man named David Brooks. As they approached, they saw him burning something that resembled clothing on his land. It looked highly suspicious, so Jessica's father asked Brooks for permission to search his farm. Brooks, however, refused and asked them to leave. This wasn't the only weird thing about Brooks. Before Jessica's disappearance, her relatives had maintained a normal relationship with him and his family. However, shortly after that, Brooks began behaving strangely. He started regularly driving slowly past their home, staring at them with an ominous smile. Jessica's parents also received mysterious phone calls where an unknown man remained silent and just breathed heavily. They suspected Brooks was behind it, but couldn't understand the reason for such behavior. After witnessing Brooks burning clothing on his property, Jessica's parents decided to once again speak to the police, who had shown little interest in the case from the beginning. They shared their observations, asking officers to visit Brooks with cadaver dogs, and they agreed. Using Jessica's clothes to track her, the dogs led them to the fire pit on Brooks' property. But no substantial evidence was found. The dogs also discovered black gloves in one of the sheds, signaling the presence of a smell associated with decomposition. Throughout the search, Brooks displayed increasingly suspicious behavior, yet the police failed to connect him to Jessica's disappearance, once again leaving empty-handed. Disappointed by the police, Jessica's father decided to reach out to the FBI. The Bureau usually refrains from initiating investigations based solely on calls from the relatives of missing persons. But this time, they decided to get involved immediately in light of the disturbing facts presented by Jessica's parents. And after a thorough research, the FBI concluded that something truly horrific might have happened to her. From this point on, a real investigation began, one that local cops had been reluctant to conduct. FBI agents collected fingerprints from Jessica's room and her car. They also seized all potential evidence for analysis and sent it all to the lab. Investigators also organized extensive search on the ground, using helicopters and gathering volunteers. They thoroughly examined the bottom of the pond near Jessica's home, considering the possibility that her body might be there. FBI agents meticulously combed through Brooks's farm, and there they found something very alarming. In one of the sheds, they found a printed photo of Jessica. After this disturbing discovery, detectives were almost certain that Brooks was somehow involved in her disappearance. They also suspected his 35-year-old brother, Joseph, as he behaved strangely while the police were searching his property. However, there was a problem. During the search, investigators found no evidence substantial enough to arrest the brothers, so they focused all their efforts on the search in the area, almost certain that Jessica was no longer alive. On September 27, 17 days after her disappearance, the police received a call. A woman was driving along the road near the river where Jessica's father had searched for her in the initial days. She saw something strange near a tree just off the road and decided to inspect it. The woman came closer, realized it resembled a human body, and called the police right away. The FBI agents arrived at the scene and indeed found the lifeless body of a young woman, missing some fingers and limbs. She had a rope with tracks of red and silver paint tied around her legs. Parts of her clothing were missing, leading detectives to believe that the perpetrator sexually abused her. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, they couldn't confirm if it was Jessica. The officers went to her house and asked her parents to help identify her. Jessica's father couldn't bring himself to look at his deceased daughter, but her mother agreed. She arrived at the scene and at first couldn't identify her, but soon she noticed a small butterfly tattoo on the body, identical to her daughter's and located on the same spot. Later, medical experts confirmed the identity of the deceased and determined that her cause of death was strangulation. Numerous bruises were also found on her body. Experts revealed that her limbs and fingers were detached post-mortem, meaning she was still alive at the time. But even that wasn't the most devastating fact. It turned out that Jessica had been alive for approximately 3 days after her disappearance. It meant that the police had a chance to save her, yet they took no action whatsoever to do that. After the discovery of the body, the FBI decided to re-interview Brooks, and this time, they found out something new. During their initial conversation, he claimed to have seen Jessica near her house on the morning she vanished. However, this time, he changed his story, stating that he hadn't seen her at all that day. Now he claimed he was at home in bed with his wife that morning. And when detectives questioned his wife, she contradicted her husband's testimony. The FBI continued to question Brooks, asking him what he would do if they found his fingerprints on the victim's body. Although there was no such evidence found, Brooks's response was extremely suspicious. He said he would have to confess to everything in that case. Later, he failed a polygraph test, so the FBI decided to arrest him and move forward with the trial. They were aware that the chances of a guilty verdict were relatively low, as they hadn't found any solid evidence linking Brooks to the murder. All they had were disturbing but indirect indications of his involvement. The detectives continued working on the case, searching for any additional evidence as the trial preparations unfolded. Investigators recalled another interesting detail. During the search of Brooks' car, they found a rope similar to the one used to tie the victim's legs. However, no DNA samples were found on it, making it another piece of circumstantial evidence. The trial began in January 2003. Brooks' lawyer insisted on the complete absence of evidence and declared his client's innocence. Something else came to light during the trial. When the body was discovered, investigators also found some missing limbs of the victim nearby. They placed them in special containers and handed them over to the local police. Ignoring labels that said, "Store it in the refrigerator," they left the boxes at room temperature, causing extensive decomposition. So even if there was some potential evidence, including possible DNA traces from the killer, it was lost due to this error. All other circumstantial pieces of evidence against Brooks lacked sufficient weight. Ultimately, the jurors couldn't reach a unanimous decision, so the man walked free. According to state laws, he could only be charged again if new evidence was found. For Jessica's parents, this was a devastating blow. They had almost no doubt that Brooks was behind their daughter's murder. Moreover, had the police taken their job more seriously, their daughter might have been saved. So, in the end, they lost all hope of achieving justice. In the following years, this case remained unsolved, and eventually, it was almost entirely abandoned. In 2012, a new detective, Lynn Hunt, joined the local police department. She was assigned to investigate unsolved cases, and her initial focus fell on the murder of Jessica Dishon. Upon reviewing the case files, she was shocked by the negligence of her predecessors. Most of the documents were filled with errors, missing any reference to conversations with the involved parties, and the evidence wasn't properly documented. In other words, it was so ineffectively handled that she had to essentially start the investigation from scratch 13 years after the murder. Her first step was to speak with Jessica's family. One of her brothers, now an adult living separately from his parents, handed her a box of Jessica's belongings from her car. He had kept it since the police returned these items to the family. Once again, Hunt was astonished at how carelessly her colleagues had handled the evidence, failing to store it properly according to protocol. Now, after so many years, these items were unlikely to help her. Yet, she diligently continued to examine everything she could find. Soon, she discovered an interesting detail among the documents. It was Brooks' medical examination report. It stated that his IQ was only 61, which is quite low. This raised concerns about all police actions, including Brooks' interrogations. Given his significantly low IQ, he might have not fully understood most of the questions and could have given less than adequate answers. All of this led Hunt to consider that the man might have no connection to the case at all, as his weird behavior could easily be explained by his extremely low IQ. Then, Hunt began to think, who else could have committed this murder? She extensively researched everyone involved in the case or living nearby. This went on until September 2014, nearly 15 years after Jessica's death. A colleague from another department called Hunt to share intriguing information. An inmate from a Kentucky state prison claimed to know the real identity of Jessica Dishon's murderer. Hunt approached this lead with slight skepticism. Usually, when inmates wanted to share some information with the police, it ended in disappointment and wasted time. Many of them just imagined some stories to secure early release or improve their conditions in prison. Still, she understood that she couldn't ignore this lead without verification. She went to the prison and met with the man who supposedly had the information. According to him, he shared a cell for some time with an individual convicted of child abuse, the same charge as his. On this common ground, the two became friends and exchanged details about their crimes occasionally. One day, the cellmate told him that, among other things, he had murdered Jessica Dishon. After that, the informant dropped a bombshell, giving the detective the name of this man, leaving her in shock. It was Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle, her father's brother. According to the informant, Stanley told him that he had sexually abused Jessica for several years while living in their home. He threatened to kill her or someone close to her if she ever talked about it. In the spring of '99, when Jessica got a boyfriend, Stanley began to fear that, sooner or later, she might confess to him about the abuse by her own uncle. On the morning of September 10th, Stanley arrived at her home when Jessica was alone. She was outside, getting into her car, having already loaded all her belongings. Stanley approached her and demanded that she break up with her boyfriend. But Jessica refused and threatened to expose him if he didn't leave her alone. He started threatening her, and she reached for the phone, attempting to dial 911. Stanley tried to grab her, but Jessica broke free and ran into the house. The man followed her to her room, struck her and bound her in her sheets before taking her to an abandoned shed not far from where her body would later be found. Stanley kept her alive there for several days, subjecting her to abuse and torture. Then he killed her, moved the body to a visible location near the road, and buried the sheets in the ground beneath the shed. He also mentioned that after the murder, he removed some of the victim's limbs, hoping to mislead the police into thinking drug traffickers were involved. Detective Hunt realized that this information was never disclosed. Only Jessica's closest relatives knew about the missing limbs. So, the informant couldn't have fabricated this detail. At last, he also added that Stanley buried Jessica's shoe beneath a broken tree near the shed. Hunt decided to verify all this information about the buried evidence. Given the shortage of stuff in the local police department, no one from there could help her, so she reached out to Jessica's brother and a few other relatives who agreed to participate in the search. She didn't tell them that Stanley might be the murderer, as she decided to find some evidence to support these shocking accusations first. On the first day of the search, they failed to uncover any clues. Under the pouring rain, they dug in the areas matching the informant's description, but it yielded no results. The next day, Jessica's brother and Hunt returned to the site. On the way, he pointed out an abandoned barn alongside the road. They headed there and started digging the soil inside. And almost immediately, there was a long-awaited breakthrough. They discovered a buried bedsheet. Hunt collected the evidence and hurried to Jessica's home. Throughout these years, her parent hadn't made any changes to her room. It remained exactly as it was on the day their daughter vanished. Thanks to this, Hunt was able to confirm that the found bedsheet was part of Jessica's bedding. It was absent from the bed, and the other linen shared the same pattern. Immediately after this discovery, Stanley was arrested and brought in for questioning. He refused to confess to the crime, although he appeared visibly shaken during the conversation with the detectives. Eventually, he was charged with murder and the case proceeded to court. Jessica's father couldn't believe that his own brother had committed such a heinous act against his daughter. He went through a phase of complete denial, but eventually came to terms with this unbearable reality. Later, he recalled that in the early days of Jessica's disappearance, it was Stanley who suggested searching for the body near the river. However, during the search, he suddenly felt sick and his brother drove him home. It turned out this happened just a few hundred yards from the barn where Jessica was located, suggesting that Stanley deliberately diverted them from finding her while she was still alive. During the preparation for the trial, Detective Hunt researched the suspect's past, trying to find some additional evidence. She already knew he had served time for assaulting another girl in their family, But Hunt soon discovered an even more disturbing fact. Several other women closely related to Stanley told the police that he had sexually abused them at a young age. The pattern was consistent. He would tell his relatives that he temporarily had nowhere to live and asked them to let him stay in their home for a while. When left alone with the girls, Stanley committed his vile deeds, using threats to silence them. Hearing all of these stories, the police concluded that Stanley had been doing this for 3 decades. Despite all of this, Detective Hunt realized that securing a conviction for the murder would be challenging since there were almost no straight pieces of evidence against Stanley, such as fingerprints or DNA. She continued to dig into the case until she stumbled upon a box of old files she hadn't examined yet. Looking through its contents, Hunt was once again shocked by the incompetence of her predecessors who initially handled the case. In the box, there was a letter dated June 26, 2002. Another informant wrote to the police the same story that Hunt heard only 12 years later from the Kentucky prison inmate. By the summer of 2002, Stanley was already serving time for assaulting an underage relative. During that time, he told his cellmate about murdering Jessica. The cellmate, who happened to be a police informant, wrote a letter to the department handling the case, disclosing all the gruesome details of what Stanley had done to his niece. And what do you think the police did? They simply ignored the letter, likely convinced of Brooks' involvement in those years, so they didn't bother considering other suspects. Once again, Hunt was disappointed by her colleagues' lack of professionalism. If only they had paid more attention to their job, this case could have been solved back in 2002. By now, after all these years, she could only await the trial, hoping that Stanley would finally face delayed justice for his actions. The process began in 2015 and Stanley declared his innocence. Present in the courtroom, Jessica's parents could hardly look at their relative who had destroyed their lives. They were also furious that he couldn't just confess to give them some sort of closure. The prosecution believed that the chances of obtaining a guilty verdict on murder charges were relatively low, mainly because there was almost no substantial evidence against him. There was also a problem with the assault charges involving other girls in the family. All of them would have to testify in court, describing Stanley's actions against them in great detail. So, the prosecution decided to offer Stanley a plea deal. They agreed to drop the death penalty in exchange for Stanley's confession, both in assaults on relatives and Jessica's murder. In the end, he agreed and pleaded guilty. As part of the deal, he wasn't required to disclose any specific details of the crimes. Jessica's parents, who desired to know the whole truth, weren't happy about it. But Stanley remained silent. Under the plea deal terms, the murderer received a 20-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Given that he was 56 at the time of sentencing, Stanley might be released at 71. After the trial, Jessica's father promised that if his brother doesn't die in prison, he'll be waiting for him to take matters into his own hands. In 2019, Stanley gave his first interview, claiming he didn't kill Jessica. According to him, he was at work that morning, but it was impossible to verify after 2 decades. He also couldn't explain how 2 unrelated informants came up with identical stories, including details only known to the murderer, such as a bedsheet's burial site. As for David Brooks, detectives still don't rule out his potential minor involvement in the case. Stanley knew him and could have asked for help in disposing of the victim's belongings. Given Brooks' low IQ, he might have not fully understood the whole situation. It's possible that he burned the girl's clothes in the fire and Stanley might have handed him the gloves with the scent of the body that the dogs detected. It's also possible that he left Jessica's photo in Stanley's shed to frame him. However, the truth may never be revealed as Brooks passed away in 2021 due to heart problems. It's worth mentioning the moment when on the 3rd day of Jessica's disappearance her younger brother heard a cry for help outside, thinking it was his sister. It's still impossible to say with certainty what happened at that time. At that time, the girl could have still been alive, but Stanley was holding her in the barn, a few miles away from her home. Most likely, the child either imagined it due to stress, or someone else was screaming. But there's a somewhat unlikely version. As we recall, right after Jessica's father rushed outside, Stanley drove up to the house, which means he was nearby. It could be that the girl was in his car with her mouth taped shut or unconscious. However, this theory seems highly improbable. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a 9.5-month pregnant woman who was attacked in her own apartment in the middle of the night. As the police began their investigation, they uncovered some very unexpected and chilling details. Eventually, they managed to unravel the truth in this complex case. But the ending was so shocking that even the detectives were stunned by those twists. Diana Diallo was born in 1959 in a quiet suburb city of Los Angeles called Tustin. Her dad was in the military and her mom worked at a small clothing factory. When Diana was 19, she met a guy named Kevin Green. She was at a bar with her friend when some men started bothering them. He was being too pushy, so Kevin decided to step in. After he made the guy go away, Diana offered to buy him a drink to say thanks. A few days later, they went on a date and things moved pretty fast from there. At the time, Kevin was already married, but he and his wife were in the process of getting divorced. Meanwhile, he and Diana moved in together and she got pregnant. As soon as Kevin's divorce was finalized, they got married the same day, eagerly awaiting the birth of their daughter. They rented an apartment in a small complex in Tustin. Kevin served in the Marines, working as a helicopter mechanic at the nearby base. Diana used to work with her mom at the clothing factory, but as her pregnancy progressed, she chose to stay at home and prepare for the arrival of their daughter. By the end of September 1979, Diana was 9.5 months pregnant, and she was due to go to the hospital any day now. On the evening of September 30th, after watching a movie together, Diana and her husband got into an argument. The stress of impending parenthood had been weighing on both of them, so they'd been fighting quite a bit lately. Kevin decided to take a drive to a nearby fast food joint to clear his head and also avoid making the whole situation even worse. About 40 minutes later, a local police department received a chilling call. It was Kevin. He said that someone had shot his wife and she needed an ambulance as soon as possible. At that time, a patrol car was nearby and officers quickly arrived at the scene. Upon entering the apartment, they found Diana lying on the bed in her bedroom, covered in blood, seemingly from a head wound resembling a gunshot. The bedroom wall was also splattered with blood. Diana showed signs of life, trying to breathe, so the officers started performing first aid while they waited for the ambulance. They also asked Kevin to leave the room, as they were still unsure of what had happened. The medics soon arrived and carefully moved Diana into the ambulance. At first, they also thought she had a gunshot wound but quickly realized it wasn't the case. The wound appeared to be caused by blunt force trauma. Kevin wanted to go with his wife, but the police didn't allow him to. They needed to take his statement, and at that moment, they were considering all possible scenarios, including his involvement in the attack. Kevin was clearly in shock and seemed to struggle to comprehend the officer's words. He even attempted to get into the ambulance, so they had to stop him. As it drove away, he began to regain his composure and finally told the police what had happened that night. Kevin explained that he and his wife had an argument, so he decided to go to a fast food joint to get burgers and clear his head. When he left the apartment, he realized he had left his keys inside, but chose not to go back for them. He simply shut the door and headed to his car. Kevin also mentioned that not far from their apartment complex, he saw a van with its back door open, and there was an African-American man walking back and forth to it. Given that it was around 2 a.m., Kevin found it a bit unusual. He drove to his favorite fast food place, but there was a long line, so he went to another one of the same chain a few miles away. He bought some burgers and headed home, which took about 40 minutes. When he got to the front door, Kevin found it wide open. He rushed inside and heard strange sounds, like someone snoring. Upon entering the bedroom, he saw Diana covered in blood, struggling to breathe, and immediately called the police. Some parts of Kevin's story immediately raised questions. For example, his decision to go for burgers in the middle of the night seemed odd. The whole trip also took him about 40 minutes, which was quite long considering that all the restaurants were close to his home. Nevertheless, officers inspected the fast food bag and the food was still warm. The receipt contained the restaurant's address and the time of purchase, corroborating his account. Based on this, The police allowed Kevin to go to the hospital, but first they had asked him to provide a blood sample. DNA analysis wasn't available at the time, but experts could compare the blood traces found at the crime scene with Kevin's blood type. When Diana arrived at the hospital, doctors confirmed that the wound on her head wasn't from a gunshot. Most likely, the assailant used a small but heavy object like a piece of wood and inflicted a series of blows. At the hospital, Diana slipped into a coma. Doctors worked tirelessly for several hours to save both the woman and her unborn child. They eventually managed to stabilize Diana's condition, but she still needed surgery. Meanwhile, investigators requested medical experts to establish whether Diana had been sexually assaulted. Besides being standard procedure, Diana's positioning upon discovery prompted the officers to consider that possibility. The experts soon confirmed this version, discovering traces of semen on her body. However, there were a few complications. Kevin had informed detectives that they had been intimate a few hours before the argument that night, and DNA analysis was not yet available at that time, so even with a biological sample from the perpetrator, little could be done. Kevin and Diana's relatives spent the entire night at the hospital, hoping Diana and her baby could survive the attack. However, by morning, something unexpected happened. One of the monitors detected a sharp deterioration in the baby's condition. And despite the extensive efforts of the doctors, the girl didn't survive. As for Diana, medics performed surgery immediately after the baby's death, and her condition was stabilized. She remained in a coma, but her chances of survival were now considered as high. However, doctors didn't expect her to return to a normal life after such serious trauma. Meanwhile, detectives worked tirelessly to track down the perpetrator who attacked Diana. After her baby passed away, the case was classified as a homicide, and the local police department put all their resources to it. Despite the fact that Kevin provided an alibi, detectives didn't rush to rule him out as a suspect. His story raised numerous questions. He had an argument with his wife just hours before the attack, left the front door unlocked, and was absent for an extended period for a supposed quick trip to the fast food joint. His claim of seeing a suspicious man near the house in the middle of the night also seemed too convenient. But there was no evidence against Kevin. Moreover, the police already had another suspect. About a year before these events, crimes with a similar modus operandi had started happening in Tustin and its surrounding areas. In December 1978, an unknown perpetrator broke into the apartment of a 17-year-old girl, struck her with a piece of wood, and sexually assaulted her, resulting in her death. For months later, the same happened to a 21-year-old woman. Someone broke into her home and struck her with a piece of wood. She didn't survive either. In July 1979, the unknown perpetrator entered another woman's apartment and did the same to her, but she managed to survive. However, the victim spent several weeks in a coma due to her injuries, and her subsequent testimony didn't bring detectives closer to fighting the attacker. In September 1979, less than a month before Diana's attack, the same happened to a 31-year-old woman who died the next day. Her son provided investigators with a description of the assailant, but the man still couldn't be identified. All these crimes shared striking similarities, just like the attack on Diana. Police were almost certain that they were dealing with a serial killer, and all their efforts were focused on catching this individual. He had already got a nickname: the Bedroom Basher. Considering that the perpetrator was committing his crimes with short intervals and operating in a relatively small suburban area of Los Angeles, detectives believed that he could strike again very soon. They decided to reach out to the public through the media and warn all women who lived alone, especially those in lower-floor apartments, as they were apparently the preferred targets of the suspected serial killer. This sparked a wave of panic. Women began clearing store shelves of any means of protection, signing up for self-defense courses, and staying with friends and relatives, trying to safeguard themselves from the dangerous criminal. Police also began patrolling the streets at nightfall. Detectives interviewed anyone who could have had any connection to these crimes, and soon they received their first leads. Several neighbors of the victims reported seeing a suspicious white, with dark, thick hair near their houses. Although this description was quite superficial, police located several matching men, investigated them, but it led nowhere. A week after Diana's attack, Doctors informed her loved ones that she had finally regained consciousness. But there was a serious problem. Diana couldn't speak or remember anything, and according to the doctors, her brain needed some time to recover, functioning at the level of a 6-year-old child. Around the same time, another attack happened in Tustin. An unknown assailant broke into the apartment of a 24-year-old woman, struck her several times with a piece of wood, and sexually assaulted her. Tragically, the victim died and the police once again failed to catch the culprit. Diana spent several more days in the hospital and her mind began to gradually return to normal. However, she had almost completely lost her memory and still couldn't recall even her parents. Doctors said her memory might eventually return, but warned her family not to recount anything to her and to allow her to remember everything on her own. Once her life-threatening condition passed, Diana was discharged from the hospital and her family took her home. Since Kevin needed to work on the military base to pay the bills, they moved in with Diana's parents, who could care for her around the clock. 2 weeks later, another tragic attack occurred in the city with a similar modus operandi, and this time, the unknown assailant killed a 17-year-old girl. After being discharged from the hospital, Diana started attending physiotherapy and her condition gradually improved. She still couldn't speak or remember what happened to her, but everything suddenly changed 6 weeks after the attack. During a physiotherapy session, the therapist brought up the attack and asked if Diana still couldn't remember who did it to her. To the doctor's surprise, Diana suddenly nodded and pointed to her wedding ring. When Diana's mother came to pick her up, the doctor told her about this, and the mother asked her daughter, "Was it Kevin who attacked you?" And Diana nodded. Right after that, her mother took her to the police station where she spoke with the lead detective. He asked Diana a few more questions and she confirmed that she suddenly remembered the moment of the attack and the perpetrator was none other than her husband. For the detective, this completely changed the course of the case. He and his team were almost certain that Diana was attacked by the same serial criminal responsible for the other similar attacks. But now, the detective faced several questions. Could Kevin be the bedroom basher? He lived in the same area where the attacks happened and even matched the description provided by several witnesses who saw a white man with dark hair. Or did Kevin decide to get rid of his wife by disguising himself as the active killer? Considering that all the actions of the bedroom basher were almost identical each single time, it wouldn't have been difficult. The detective thought that if he arrested Kevin now, his involvement in other crimes might never be proven, and Kevin himself could flee as soon as he realized he was caught. So he made a difficult decision. He asked Diana and her mother to pretend that Diana still remembered nothing and to return home to Kevin. This was obviously a huge challenge for both of them, but they agreed nonetheless. Investigators put Kevin under surveillance and closely monitored all his movements, hoping to eventually link him to other attacks. Police spoke with Kevin's friends to learn more about the suspect, and they quickly found out something interesting. Those who knew him well said that his relationship with Diana was quite tense. The couple argued frequently, a fact also confirmed by neighbors who often heard their screams. According to friends, Kevin regularly complained to them that Diana refused to be intimate with him in the final months of her pregnancy. Yet, Kevin had described his relationship with Diana to detectives as nearly perfect. But besides that, detectives couldn't gather any additional useful information. Kevin behaved quite normally. He went to work and came back home without lingering anywhere else and didn't raise any suspicions. The police also received results from the lab revealing an interesting discovery. Besides the attacker's semen, they found skin particles with blood under Diana's nails. Specialists matched the blood type of the attacker to Kevin's blood sample. And it matched. It meant that Kevin had the same blood type as the person who attacked Diana. Based on this information, detectives came up with the most likely version of what had happened on that fateful night. Kevin indeed bought burgers at a fast food joint a few miles from home. The time on the receipt and cashier's words confirmed his presence. So detectives believed he could have attacked Diana before leaving home, then quickly went to the fast food restaurant to create an alibi, explaining the extended 40-minute trip. Regarding motive, detectives theorized that Diana's refusal to engage in intimacy served as the trigger. Despite Kevin's claim that they had had sex hours before the incident, he frequently complained to friends about Diana's reluctance for months. Given the severity of the attack, detectives believe this was Kevin's breaking point. The police re-interviewed Diana, who confirmed she vividly remembered the attack and Kevin was indeed the one who assaulted her. During the conversation, her mother said they could no longer pretend and live under the same roof as Kevin. After that, detectives decided to arrest him and proceed with legal action. Kevin was taken into custody while he was at a store to avoid risking Diana's family and conducting the arrest at their home. Kevin refused to admit guilt, insisting that everything happened exactly as he had told them. Preparation for the trial took 10 months. During this time, Diana's physical condition gradually improved. She could speak again, although not without difficulty. Diana was also examined by several doctors, who came to a unanimous conclusion that her brain had sufficiently recovered, and she was a reliable witness. Diana testified in court, confirming that the person who attacked her that night was indeed her husband. Kevin's defense insisted on his innocence, trying to use the fast food alibi, but it wasn't enough against the victim's testimony. In November 1980, Kevin was found guilty of killing his child and assaulting his wife. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Regarding Kevin's possible involvement in other murders and assaults, detectives noticed something interesting. Before Kevin's arrest, 2 more similar crimes occurred in their county, but both victims survived. They still hadn't been able to identify the attacker, so his identity remained unknown. But after Kevin's arrest, the attacks suddenly stopped. Before that, the bedroom basher committed his crimes quite frequently, sometimes with only a few weeks between them. But once Kevin was arrested, there were no more similar crimes at all. Right after the sentencing, Diana filed for divorce and Kevin didn't try to object it. Since then, Diana continued to work on her recovery, but it was quite challenging considering the injuries she sustained. Her brain almost returned to normal, but some problems remained with her forever. She partially lost her hearing and vision and still struggled to speak. As for Kevin, he continued to insist on his innocence for years. His time in prison wasn't easy. Other inmates repeatedly attacked him for killing a child, and Kevin ended up in the hospital multiple times. When he had the opportunity to apply for parole, the commission denied it, and over the following years, he received 3 more denials. The main reason for these decisions was that Kevin had never admitted his guilt, which was seen as a lack of remorse. When DNA analysis became widely utilized in forensics, Kevin attempted to request analysis of the existing samples and comparison with his DNA. But this request was rejected due to the fact that he didn't have enough money to pay for the analysis. This went on until 1996, when the police department reopened the investigation into a series of attacks allegedly committed by the bedroom basher. Throughout this time, semen samples taken from the victims' bodies were stored in the laboratory. Now, detectives had the opportunity not only to determine if one person was behind all these crimes, but also possibly to identify them. Kevin remained the prime suspect, but when experts obtained the DNA profile of the perpetrator and added it to the database, there was an unexpected twist. All these samples matched another man named Gerald Parker. Parker was arrested in the same year as Kevin. He assaulted a 13-year-old girl in Tustin and was caught shortly after. At the time, detectives did not link this crime to the series of attacks because they had a different pattern. While the bedroom basher targeted victims late at night in their apartments, Parker abducted the girl on the street. Since then, he had been serving his sentence in prison and was set to be released in just a few days. After investigators obtained DNA matches for Parker in all the unsolved cases, they also remembered the attack on Diana. Although this crime was considered solved, detectives still considered its connection to the other similar cases highly likely. Now, they understood that Kevin definitely wasn't the serial killer, leaving them with just one question. Did he really attack his wife? During those years, Parker served at the same military base as Kevin and also owned a dark-colored van. As we recall, on the very first day, Kevin told the police that he saw an African-American man in front of their house walking near a dark van. This made detectives wonder, what if Parker was behind the attack on Diana? The local prosecutor visited Kevin in prison and informed him of the progress in the investigation of the bedroom basher murder series. He then asked Kevin to provide a direct sample of his DNA for analysis. Kevin, who had been trying to do this for years, immediately agreed. While experts conducted the analysis, detectives went to see Parker in prison. At that point, they hadn't yet charged him with the series of attacks because they needed time to prepare such a complex case. Nevertheless, the police decided to talk to the suspect, hoping he might give them a confession. Parker began to deny his involvement in the series of crimes, so detectives shifted the conversation to the attack on Diana. Before questioning him, they reviewed Parker's case and found something interesting. After his arrest for assaulting the girl, he told the police that military service was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Detectives decided to use this to their advantage and questioned how he could let another soldier take the blame for his crime. They continued pressing Parker, appealing to his loyalty to the military, until he suddenly said that another person was indeed serving time for the murder he committed. He continued, admitting that on that night, he did indeed drive to Kevin's house in his van. His plan was to roam the neighborhood, peering into ground floor windows, as he had done many times before, looking for his next victim. But this time, he heard screams from Kevin and Diana's apartment, and a man came out onto the street. Parker noticed that he didn't lock the door, waited for a few minutes, then entered the apartment and assaulted Diana. He also said that he didn't know her husband since they had different duties on the military base. Parker also confessed to the other crimes, admitting to 6 murders and 3 non-lethal attacks. After the police obtained confessions, DNA results proved Parker's involvement and Kevin's innocence. The prosecutor promised to overturn his sentence as soon as possible, and a few days later, Kevin walked free after spending 16 years behind bars. The twist in this case caused a widespread outcry. It wasn't just because an innocent man spent nearly half his life for someone else's crime, but also because it took so long for the police to establish the real killer's identity. However, that wasn't the last twist in this case. When Kevin was released, the state of California agreed to pay him $10,000, which was a relatively small amount of money even for those times. Several years later, he got an additional compensation of $100 for each day spent in prison, totaling $620,000. But the story didn't end there. Despite Kevin's full exoneration, Diana refused to believe in his innocence. Up until that point, she had claimed Kevin was the only one who attacked her. However, after biological material from her body matched Parker's DNA, she came up with a new version. Diana claimed that on that night, Kevin attacked and assaulted her before leaving, and then Parker entered the apartment and did the same to her. Parker himself repeatedly stated that when he entered the apartment, the woman was simply lying on the bed without any visible injuries or signs of distress. He also claimed that he was the one who struck her on the head. Diana's family proposed another theory, suggesting that Kevin might have asked Parker to commit the crime, which is why he left the house that night, leaving the door open. But Parker continued to insist that he didn't know Kevin. There were numerous people on the military base, many of whom didn't know each other personally. Besides, such a version would imply that Kevin should have known Parker was the serial killer to ask him something like that, which he vehemently denied. Kevin also denied any connection with Parker, insisting he would never harm Diana, let alone their unborn daughter. He maintained that he left the door unlocked simply because he didn't want to return for the keys right after the argument with his wife. He also added that he still blames himself for that decision. Diana insists on her version of events to this day, and there could be a simple explanation for that. The trauma she endured as a result of the attack had a profound impact on her brain. When she emerged from the coma, doctors warned all her relatives not to tell her of what had happened. The reason was that at the time, her brain could accept any information as true, and she would believe such memories to be accurate and real. It's worth noting that even at the time of Kevin's release, 16 years after the incident, she continued to experience serious difficulties. For example, Diana struggled to process fast speech, indicating that the consequences of the trauma had an irreparable impact on her brain. It cannot be ruled out that the trauma is the primary reason for her conviction of Kevin's involvement. As for Parker, in 1999, he was sentenced to death, but this sentence has never been carried out. After many years of waiting in prison, California imposed a moratorium on executions, so Parker continues to serve his sentence behind bars to this day. Hi guys, My name is Brandon, and today we'll delve into the case of a young girl who left her school bus just a few hundred yards from her house and vanished without a trace. As the police began their search, they uncovered chilling clues and faced numerous unexpected twists. The search for answers spanned many years until detectives finally uncovered the truth about what happened to her. Angie Hausman was born on February 18, 1984, in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father left the family before she was born, and she never knew him. When she was 1 year old, Angie's mom married a man named Ronald, and they had a son. He and Angie got along pretty well, and she adored her younger brother. Angie was a very easygoing child, always seeking friendship with everyone around her. Her family lived in a quiet suburban area of St. Louis. In 1993, when Angie was 9, she attended the 4th grade at elementary school, located just over a mile from her house. To get there, she used to take a bus from the nearest stop, and her parents felt relatively safe letting her go alone because it was located just a few hundred yards from her house. Usually, Angie walked to the bus stop with some neighborhood kids. After school, they were watched over by several parents along the road from their windows. It became a sort of tradition among neighbors to ensure the children safely made their way from the bus stop to their homes. On November 18th, Angie, as usual, went to school and finished around 3 p.m. She took the school bus to her stop with a few neighborhood kids, and they walked home together. The other kids lived closer to the bus stop, leaving Angie alone about halfway. It was only a few minutes' walk, but time passed, and Angie didn't show up. About half an hour later, Angie's parents started worrying. She often stopped to chat with the other kids, but it had never taken this long before. Her mom and stepdad decided to go outside and walk along the route from their house to the bus stop. They spoke with other kids from the same school, who confirmed that Angie arrived with them and headed toward home. The parents also spoke with neighbors who usually kept an eye on the kids from their windows, but both women were busy that day and didn't witness anything. Angie's parents and their friends quickly initiated the search. They began scouring the area along the route from the bus stop to Angie's home. This continued into the evening, and as darkness fell, Angie's parents decided to call the police. Officers immediately joined the search. Given the cold weather, it appeared unlikely that Angie would wander off on her own, prompting the police to initially explore worst-case scenarios. Adding to their heightened concern was another recent incident. Just 10 days prior, in a nearby area, an unknown perpetrator had nearly abducted an 11-year-old girl. He approached her as she got off the school bus and attempted to drag her into the bushes, but she managed to escape. Since the assailant was still at large, the police considered the possibility of his involvement in Angie's disappearance. Officers called in canine units, and the dogs picked up Angie's scent near the bus stop. They tracked it roughly halfway to her house before abruptly losing it. This suggested that Angie may have gotten into a vehicle at that point, further indicating a potential abduction. The police also deployed helicopters with thermal sensors and searched the banks of a small stream near Angie's home, but they found neither the girl nor her belongings. Unfortunately, the first day of searching yielded no results. By morning, the police turned to the media and information about Angie's disappearance quickly spread across the city. In just one day, the police department received over 300 calls. To handle this influx of leads, they had to involve more than 20 new officers, yet all these leads did not help them find the girl. Detectives explored all possible scenarios and from the early days began scrutinizing Angie's stepdad. The man claimed no involvement in her disappearance and insisted he would never harm her. He agreed to a polygraph test and any other checks so that the police would stop wasting their time on him and focus on finding Angie. Investigators also located Angie's biological father, and here they discovered something weird. The man had never interacted with his daughter, but according to her mother, he had driven past their house several times, watching Angie play outside. Detectives found this suspicious, but the man had an airtight alibi. On the third day, the FBI joined the case, and the police department shifted even more officers to it. They all understood that something terrible must have happened to Angie. She just couldn't have survived on the streets in such cold weather. At one point, the police received a lead about a possible suspect. Someone reported a strange man slowly driving a blue sedan in Angie's neighborhood. His description matched the account of the girl who had narrowly escaped an abduction just 10 days before Angie's disappearance. Investigators decided to create a composite sketch of this person. It was featured in the news, and volunteers distributed thousands of flyers, but the identity of this man remained unknown. Soon, the girl's disappearance made it to national television, attracting even more leads. Police diligently examined each one, but none brought them closer to finding Angie. Due to the heightened attention to this case, psychics quickly got involved, calling Angie's home and sharing their alleged visions. One of them claimed that the girl was alive and even specified a location where she was being held, a large national park 25 miles from Angie's home, but detectives paid no attention to their words. A $10,000 reward was also offered for any information about Angie's whereabouts, leading to an increase in tips. During the investigation, detectives uncovered a pretty disturbing fact. A few days before her disappearance, Angie told her teacher that she was planning to go on a nature trip with her uncle. The catch was, there was no uncle, and her parents had no idea what their daughter meant by that. Investigators considered the possibility that Angie might have known her abductor prior to the incident and referred to him as her uncle in the conversation with her teacher. However, they didn't find anything about this mysterious man. In the following days, detectives made no progress, but everything changed on November 27th. 9 days after Angie's disappearance, a hunter called the police. He had arrived at the national park and spotted a human body in the woods. Upon arrival at the location, the police were confronted with a horrifying scene. There was a body of a girl tied to a tree, missing any clothing, and her head was entirely wrapped in tape except for her nose. Her hands were also bound with handcuffs. Near the site, there was a bag with items which helped the police immediately realize they had found Angie's body. Her belongings, including notebooks with her name, were in the bag. The body was handed over to medical examiners, revealing even more shocking details. As soon as they removed the tape from her head, experts found a piece of underwear in her mouth. They also determined that the girl had died just a few hours before the discovery, meaning she had been kept alive for 9 days and then taken to this location where she froze to death. Experts had concluded that the victim had suffered numerous injuries and had been sexually assaulted. Forensic analysts carefully examined all items found at the crime scene and managed to find a fingerprint on the tape used to wrap Angie's head. They tried to find matches in the database and among several suspects, but it led to no leads. After the discovery of the body, the police dedicated even more resources to the investigation. Local residents were shocked by such cruelty and feared for their children, escorting them everywhere, meeting them at bus stops, and not letting them out of their sight for a moment. Just a few days after Angie's discovery, their concerns heightened even further. On December 1st, a 10-year-old girl named Casey disappeared. She lived in another town, only 10 miles from Angie's house. Casey had asked her mother if she could visit her friends who lived just a few hundred yards away, but she had never reached their house. Casey vanished on the way, and the police couldn't locate her. Detectives began to fear that they might have a serial killer on their hands. They didn't rule out the possibility that the same person was behind both abductions, but they had no evidence supporting this theory. 10 days later, Casey's body was found in St. Louis, and she was wrapped in 2 bedsheets and covered with a pink curtain, with the cause of death being multiple severe blows to the head. Detectives couldn't find any clues that would lead them to the killer. Moreover, they started to doubt that the same person who killed Casey was responsible for Angie's death. The nature of these crimes was noticeably different, leading them to consider the possibility of dealing with 2 different murderers. In the same month, the detectives identified the man who had attempted to abduct a girl a few days before Angie's disappearance. He turned out to be 37-year-old Gary, who often came to St. Louis for work. He was immediately checked for involvement in the 2 murders, but the man had a solid alibi. He wasn't in the city during the disappearances of Angie and Casey, although during the investigation he admitted to assaulting 4 other girls and eventually received a 5-year prison sentence. In February of the following year, detectives had found a breakthrough. When they discovered Casey's body, tire tracks were found nearby. Their photos were handed over to experts, who determined that the tracks were left by a pickup truck, widely used by a popular car rental company. Armed with this information, detectives interviewed residents in Casey's neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen a pickup from this company. Given that these vehicles were covered with vibrant brand logos that were easily distinguishable from others, the detectives got lucky. One woman told them that she had seen the pickup from this company near her neighbor's house about a week after Casey's disappearance. Police quickly discovered that there was a woman living with her partner and brother. She claimed that none of them had rented such a pickup and they had no connection to this case. But detectives didn't rush to believe her. They obtained a search warrant for the house and found blood traces belonging to Casey in the basement along with the murder weapon. Further investigation revealed that the woman's brother, Thomas, had rented the pickup. Initially, he denied everything, but when confronted with the existing evidence, he finally confessed. According to his account, Casey had knocked on his door, wanting to invite his nephews to go to the street with her. He invited her into her house, took her to the basement, and attempted to assault her. When she screamed, he struck her with a heavy object and covered the body with bedsheets. After the murder, Thomas went to work and upon his return, his sister informed him that she had seen the body in the basement. However, she added that she didn't want to know what happened and demanded to get rid of it as quickly as possible. Casey remained in the basement for a whole week because active searches were underway and Thomas was afraid to move her. When things calmed down a bit, he rented the pickup, took the body to St. Louis and left it there. Thomas was eventually sentenced to death, but he died in prison from illnesses several years later. In connection to Angie's case, he denied any involvement, leading detectives to conclude that these crimes were, indeed, unrelated. The investigation hit another standstill for many months, with fewer and fewer leads coming in. Several years after Angie's murder, detectives faced another challenge, the expiration of the monetary reward for information, raising concerns about a decline in public assistance. However, an unexpected turn came in 2001 when a businessman in the community donated $250,000 as a reward for information on Angie's case. This generous amount of money, one of the largest at the time, led to a massive influx of tips for the police. But, unfortunately, all of these leads proved to be dead ends. This continued until 2001, when detectives received a call from prison. Inmate named Corey Fox confessed to over 10 murders, including Angie Houseman's. Detectives rushed to speak with him, and Fox recounted how he and his friend abducted her from the street, keeping her captive in his house for several days. Initially, the criminals planned to demand a ransom, but concerns about potential identification led them to choose murder. To the surprise of detectives, Fox provided many accurate details, such as tying her to a tree, even specifying that his accomplice was using her underwear as a gag. However, discrepancies arose when questioned about how they restrained her hands. Fox claimed they used plastic handcuffs, whereas in reality they used iron ones. Detectives also found out that Fox couldn't have committed some of the murders he confessed to. Police concluded that he likely fabricated parts of his confession, possibly drawing information from extensive news coverage on Angie Houseman's case. In the summer of 2002, another event reignited attention on Angie's case. In a different area of St. Louis, an unknown man abducted a 6-year-old girl from her home and killed her. Police initially considered the possible connection to Angie's case, but it turned out otherwise. The perpetrator was apprehended just a few hours later. It was a neighbor who confessed during interrogation. Several more years passed until 2007, when detectives decided to revisit the case. Reviewing the documents, they noticed a peculiar detail. Shortly after discovering Angie's body, police noticed a parked car nearby with a man named Roger Martin inside. When questioned about his presence, Roger claimed he came to the area for hunting. However, upon a brief inspection of his car, the police officer found no hunting gear. This led the new detective team to take a closer look at Roger, discovering his criminal record for offenses against children. Moreover, he had assaulted one of his victims near the location where Angie's body was found. Remarkably, all of these crimes occurred before Angie's death, and this information was in the database. But during that time, the police did not thoroughly investigate Roger, prompting the new detective team to start from scratch. Roger was called in for questioning. He denied any involvement in Angie's murder, insisting he was near the location by chance. Roger added that during the time the girl was left there, he was still at work, although the police couldn't confirm this alibi. Despite a 9-hour interrogation, detectives couldn't reach any conclusive results. They took Roger's fingerprints, comparing them with the one left on the tape from the victim's head. Experts determined they didn't match, leading to Roger's release. While the police refrained from ruling him out as a suspect, they lacked substantial evidence to hold him. There was no progress in the case until 2018 when the St. Louis Police Department formed a dedicated task force. The new detectives aimed to re-examine all existing evidence. With significant advances in technology since '93, they hoped to uncover new leads. The detectives focused on 3 key pieces of evidence: the handcuffs, tape from Angie's head, and her underwear used to silence her. Despite repeated attempts since '93, experts struggled to find the perpetrator's DNA on them. Undeterred, they decided to re-examine these items with modern technology. Firstly, they attempted to find DNA on the handcuffs, but it was quite challenging as they were almost entirely covered in the victim's blood. They then turned to the tape from Angie's head, encountering another issue. When they opened the box containing this evidence, they found that the tape had literally disintegrated over the years. Finally, they examined the underwear. Despite having little hope for this particular evidence, as it had been in the victim's mouth for several hours, potentially erasing any foreign DNA, they pursued it as a last resort. Employing state-of-the-art technology, they meticulously inspected every inch of the underwear, and at last, there was a breakthrough. A tiny sample of unfamiliar DNA was discovered, sufficient for analysis. Experts confirmed the DNA belonged to a male, immediately uploading it to the FBI database. In such cases, it's pretty common not to find any matches, requiring additional efforts to identify the person. However, luck was on detectives' side this time. As soon as the DNA sample was uploaded, they received a full match. The DNA belonged to 58-year-old Earl Cox, who had been in prison since 2003. Cox had never come to the police radar regarding Angie's case, but his criminal history was substantial. Earl first landed behind bars during his military service in 1982 in Germany. He had a part-time job as a babysitter until 4 girls reported that he had sexually assaulted them. Earl received an 8-year prison sentence in the USA and was discharged from the Army. After serving only 3 years, he was released early and relocated to St. Louis. 4 years later, Earl was arrested again when 2 7-year-old girls accused him of sexual assault. Despite the charges being dropped due to insufficient evidence, his arrest violated the terms of his parole, leading to an additional year in prison. Upon his release in 1992, he resettled in St. Louis, where his relatives lived. A year later, he seemingly abducted and killed Angie, but we'll delve into that shortly. In 2002, Earl faced another arrest for running a major anonymous internet platform where predators shared materials depicting child abuse. The FBI had been investigating him for a while, and Earl took the bait when an undercover agent posing as a 14-year-old girl contacted him. Earl expressed intentions to make her his slave, sent money for a bus ticket, and showed up at the agreed meeting place. Instead of a girl, Earl encountered armed FBI agents, resulting in his arrest. On his computer, they discovered 45,000 photos of child abuse, along with evidence that he was the mastermind behind the perverse platform. This information led to the arrest of 60 more individuals associated with the site, marking one of the country's largest operations against pedophiles. In 2003, Earl was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but when his term ended, a judge refused to release the offender, using a legal loophole allowing the detention of individuals deemed a serious threat to children. As a result, he remained behind bars, and in 2019, his DNA matched the sample from Angie Hausman's case. Detectives went to prison to speak with him. However, Earl denied his involvement and promptly asked for a lawyer. The police recognized that the man had little chance of winning the case in court, given the presence of his DNA. But they decided to try something else. Investigators reached out to Earl's lawyer, stating they would seek the death penalty for Angie's murder. However, if the perpetrator confessed, the prosecution would abandon the death penalty in favor of a life sentence. Apparently aware that he would likely lose the case, Earl agreed to the deal. Detectives returned to the prison, where he provided his version of events. It's worth noting that some parts of his story sounded outright implausible, but the crucial thing for investigators was the confession to the murder. Earl claimed that on November 18, 1993, he was driving through the area where his mother and sister lived. His car stalled in the middle of the road, and while he was trying to figure out what was wrong with it, a school bus pulled up and several kids got off. They all went into their houses except for one girl, Angie. According to Earl, when she approached him, they had a brief chat, and he noticed she looked freezing. He offered her a ride in his car, and as he claimed, she agreed. He then took Angie to Burger King, fed her, and brought her to his home, where he sexually assaulted her for several days. After some time, he decided to get rid of Angie, took her to the location where her body would later be found, and tied her to a tree. Allegedly, she was still alive at that moment. Detectives doubted the truthfulness of certain parts of this story. Angie clearly couldn't agree to go anywhere with a stranger, especially considering she only had a short distance to walk home. Investigators also questioned the car breakdown in Earl's story. He claimed the car stalled, but as soon as Angie approached, the car surprisingly started again. More likely, the perpetrator noticed Angie and immediately decided to abduct her. He could have lured her into the car with some lies or even threats. It appeared much more realistic than Earl's version. Nevertheless, detectives obtained what they needed: the confession to the murder. In August 2020, he appeared before a judge who sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Unfortunately, Angie's mother did not live to see this moment. She passed away from cancer in 2016. Her husband, Ronald, told reporters that Earl should have been tried for 2 murders because he held him responsible for his wife's death. After losing her daughter, she lost all interest in life and essentially died. As for Earl, his story didn't end with the verdict. The prosecutor wanted to review the case of sexual abuse involving 2 7-year-old girls, for which the offender faced no consequences, serving just a year in prison for parole violation. Police reached out to one of his victims, now an adult, asking her to testify against Earl. The man, already destined to spend the rest of his life behind bars, admitted his guilt, and he was sentenced to an additional 10 years in prison. After the sentence was announced, his victim spoke in court. She expressed that despite Earl's heinous crime, she would lead a happy and fulfilling life while he rightly fades away in prison. Alright guys, share your thoughts on the story in the comments section and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Hi guys, my name is Brandon, and today we'll delve into the case of a young mother who went out to celebrate New Year's and disappeared. Police uncovered some eerie clues, but couldn't get to the truth. It wasn't until 35 years later that there was a long-awaited breakthrough, and everyone finally learned what happened to her on that fateful New Year's Day. Tanya McKinley was born on January 25, 1961, in the small American town of Milton, Florida. Growing up in a loving family, she shared a close bond with her older sister. They enjoyed playing outside together, skateboarding and bowling. After finishing high school, Tanya decided to move to Pensacola, about 25 miles away from her hometown. She wanted to explore the medical field and focused on one of the quickest professions to enter, a medical transcriptionist. No medical degree was required to become one. All Tanya needed was to attend special courses. Her cousin, Vanita, chose to relocate with her, and the 2 women shared an apartment to save on rent. Soon after moving, Tanya met a guy named Tim, and they began dating. Eventually, they moved in together, and in 1983, their son, Timothy, was born. While Tanya was thrilled to become a mother, her relationship with Tim wasn't perfect. They argued quite often, and about a year after their child's birth, they decided to part ways. At the end of '84, Tanya temporarily moved in with her cousin, who by that time had a husband and 2 children. Tanya planned to find a place of her own and move out as soon as she gets the opportunity. On December 31st, Tanya, along with Vanita and her husband, decided to celebrate New Year's Eve at a local bar. They left their kids at a late-night daycare and set off to ring in the new year. They had a lively evening, filled with laughter and dancing. Tanya also saw a lot of familiar faces at the bar. When midnight struck, They welcomed the new year of 1985, and Vanita, with her husband, prepared to head home. The daycare, where they had left their children, was closing at 1 a.m., giving them just 1 hour to pick them up. But Tanya wanted to stay at the bar a little longer. Given that her sole focus had been on work and caring for her son for the past 2 years, this was her only opportunity to unwind and relax, so she didn't want to miss it. Tanya asked her sister to pick up her son from the daycare, and Vanita agreed. Since they lived together and Vanita had to collect her own kids, it wasn't a problem. Before parting ways, Vanita asked Tanya how she planned to get home since they had arrived at the bar in their car. But Tanya assured her that she would easily find someone to give her a ride, considering the fact that there were many familiar faces at the bar. On the morning of January 1st, Vanita woke up and, to her surprise, realized that Tanya had not returned yet. It seemed odd, since she should have been back long ago. Vanita thought that Tanya might have gone to stay with one of her friends, so she wasn't overly concerned initially. But everything changed soon after. Vanita's worried mother-in-law knocked on their door, delivering the shocking news. Tanya had been found dead. That night, around 3 a.m., a Pensacola resident and her daughter headed to a vet clinic due to some urgent health issues with their dog. However, as the woman left home, her daughter noticed something strange on the roadside. She thought it was a mannequin and mentioned it to her mother. The woman decided to take a closer look and was horrified to realize it was a human body. She immediately returned home and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and found the body of a young woman lying in an empty lot near the road. Her tights were pulled down, the dress was lifted, and her shoes were missing. Next to the victim, they discovered a blue towel with red stains resembling blood. Police identified the deceased as 23-year-old Tanya McKinley. A few streets away, they discovered her shoes, along with a purse containing an ID in her name. The body was handed over to medical experts, while investigators continued to examine the crime scene. It was quickly established that the victim was likely killed elsewhere. There was no blood near her body except for the towel stains, and there were traces on the ground indicating that the body had been dragged from the road towards the roadside. On the towel and the victim's body, police found their first potential leads. There were several human hairs, as well as pubic hairs and dog fur. They assumed that the first 2 samples belonged to the killer, possibly someone with a dog. Medical experts determined that Tanya suffered a blow to the head with a heavy object, but the cause of death was strangulation. They also confirmed that the victim had been sexually assaulted. The experts collected a semen sample from her body, but in those years, DNA analysis had not yet become widely used in forensics. All they could establish was that the suspect had type B blood. Considering that these clues didn't lead detectives to the killer, they began compiling a list of potential suspects. Their focus initially shifted to Tim, the victim's ex-boyfriend. Speaking with Tanya's relatives and friends, the police learned about the issues in their relationship and constant arguments both before and after the birth of their son. It turned out that when Tanya decided to end the relationship, Tim was against it. He didn't want to part ways with Tanya and continued trying to persuade her. Tim consistently called Tanya, visited her, and behaved as if he couldn't accept the breakup. Investigators considered that on New Year's Eve, Tim might have followed Tanya to the bar, leading to a confrontation that ended in murder. They brought the man in for questioning, but he denied any involvement. Tim also agreed to provide hair samples. Although experts couldn't extract DNA from them, they were able to compare the hairs under a microscope, which would have been sufficient enough to establish similarity. However, Tim's hair significantly differed from those found on the victim's body and the towel. Based on this fact, he was temporarily ruled out as a suspect. After that, detectives turned their attention to everyone who was present at the bar on New Year's Eve. They questioned Vanita about any individuals who might have behaved strangely or aggressively towards Tanya, but she insisted that the evening had passed without any incidents and proceeded very well. The police also discovered that after breaking up with her boyfriend, Tanya briefly dated a man named Kurt. He happened to be the bartender at the same bar where she celebrated the New Year, and it was a shift that night. They spoke with Kurt, but he claimed no involvement in the murder. According to him, after finishing his shift, he went to a New Year's party with friends. Investigators interviewed his friends, leading to an intriguing discovery. They confirmed Kurt's presence at the party, but said that he didn't arrive immediately after ending his shift at the bar. Gathering all the testimonies, police concluded that theoretically, Kurt had enough time to commit the crime. Through multiple interviews with individuals from the bar, detectives determined that Tanya was last seen alive at 1:15 a.m. However, no one witnessed her leaving the bar. The police also interviewed residents in the area where the body was found. One family recalled driving by that spot around 2 a.m. and stated they were certain there was no body. Investigators established that Tanya was killed within a little over an hour and a half from the last time she was seen alive, and Kurt didn't have a solid alibi during this specific time frame. He agreed to a polygraph test, and the results were inconclusive, showing deceptive answers to some questions. But the lab experts determined that Kurt's blood type did not match the blood type of the killer as identified from the semen sample, so the man was eliminated from the list of suspects. Police continued their search for other potential suspects, but their efforts led to dead ends. The analysis of the killer's semen wasn't possible, and they lacked any substantial evidence or witnesses, quickly hitting a dead end in this case. The only thing investigators were nearly certain of was that the perpetrator must have lived in the area where the body was found. This location was secluded from main roads, situated at the edge of an extensive residential area. Police doubted that an unfamiliar perpetrator would go there with the victim's body in a car without any knowledge of the area. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years. Timothy, who was only 18 months old when his mother died, was raised by his father and Tanya's family. They all decided to shield the child from the truth about what happened to his mother. As he grew older, relatives told him that Tanya had died in a car accident. This continued until he turned 14. With Christmas approaching, the boy grew curious about the gift his father had prepared for him. Timothy decided to search through his father's closet, only to stumble upon something far more chilling than a mere present. He found a letter written by his father, addressed to the popular TV host, Montel Williams. In the letter, the man asked him to mention the unsolved murder of Tanya, hoping that the publicity would help move the case. Timothy read detailed accounts of the murder in the letter, and that's how he learned the true fate of his mother. In the early 2000s, the local police department reopened Tanya's case, hoping that advancements in DNA analysis would help identify the killer, so they sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Upon examination, experts concluded that the blood on the blue towel found near the body did not belong to Tanya, but to an unknown man. They obtained his DNA profile and uploaded it to the FBI database, but there are no matches. The case went cold again until it was reopened in 2015, exactly 30 years after the murder. The killer's DNA still had not appeared in the FBI database, prompting detectives to try a different approach. Modern tools allowed them to search not only for exact matches, but also for partial ones. They considered the possibility that the database might contain relatives of the killer, which could lead them to the suspect. They began to search and eventually narrowed their focus to a specific individual from the FBI database. His DNA shared some patterns with the sample from Tanya's killer, but the resemblance was relatively weak. Police delved into his family background, even reaching out to his relatives. They agreed to assist and even provided their DNA samples for comparison. After examining the samples, experts reached a disheartening conclusion. They found that this family had no connection to the suspect, leading the detectives, once again, with no substantial leads. In 2018, journalist Tony Adam took an interest in this case. Despite not specializing in crime, his personal interest in this subject drew him to the unsolved murder of Tanya. He wanted to help and reached out to the investigators handling the case. Detectives approached his willingness to help with a degree of skepticism. While an experienced journalist, Tony had no background in criminal investigations. However, given the lack of progress in the case, police figured he couldn't make things worse. The journalist joined the investigation and established connections with Tanya's family. They could see his genuine interest in resolving the case and the significant effort he was putting into it. For instance, he worked to garner media coverage for the case, bringing additional attention to it. He also brought a fresh perspective to an investigation that had lingered for over 3 decades. A year later, in 2019, detectives decided to make another attempt to find the killer's relatives. This time, they sought assistance from Parabon, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. In their previous attempt, investigators had only looked for potential relatives through the FBI database, which contains samples from various criminals. However, Parabon examined public genetic databases significantly broader in scope. Anyone could upload their DNA sample to these databases for purposes such as finding relatives or exploring their ancestry. Experts diligently worked through potential relatives of the killer, methodically examining their family trees to identify someone fitting the criteria of their suspect. They sought a man who, in 1985, was old enough to commit the crime and lived in the area. This process took almost a year, presenting an incredibly challenging task for the experts. However, in February 2020, they finally identified a man who theoretically could be the killer. It was 57-year-old Daniel Wells who lived in the same city at the time of the murder. Detectives delved into his background and found that Wells had come to the attention of the police several times. In the late 80s, he was arrested for assault and later for indecent exposure. As of 2020, Daniel continued to live in Pensacola, working as a carpenter with a wife and children. But detectives needed a sample of his DNA for a direct comparison with the killer's profile to establish his potential connection to this murder. Due to the absence of any solid evidence, police proceeded cautiously with Daniel, fearing he might flee once he realized he had been identified. They put him under surveillance and soon the police got an opportunity to obtain his DNA. Daniel threw a cigarette butt out of his car window near his workplace. Investigators seized it and immediately sent it to the lab. Experts extracted DNA from the saliva on the filter and compared it with the killer's DNA from Tanya's case. The results showed a perfect match. 35 years later, the police finally identified the perpetrator, and on the same day he was arrested. Despite having the results of his DNA analysis, investigators wanted to obtain a confession from Daniel. So they chose to proceed cautiously and refrain from revealing all their evidence at once. They asked patrol officers to pull over the suspect's car under the pretext of a standard ID check. Detectives then approached Daniel and told him that he needed to go to the station with them. They deliberately withheld any additional information, keeping him in suspense. During questioning, investigators slowly directed the conversation towards Tanya's murder, asking about Daniel's whereabouts that night. Initially, he denied ever knowing the woman, and that's when detectives revealed that his DNA was found at the crime scene. Daniel continued to deny everything but grew increasingly nervous with each question. Detectives emphasized the undebatable nature of the DNA results, leaving him no chance of avoiding consequences. They made it clear that the only way to ease his situation was to confess. And it worked. At some point, Daniel began to speak. Initially, he tried to justify the presence of his DNA by suggesting that he might have had sex with Tanya on that night. But detectives didn't believe this version and continued to demand the truth. And eventually, Daniel confessed to killing Tanya on that New Year's Eve. However, his story raised some serious questions. He admitted to being at the bar where he met Tanya, who mentioned she was looking for a ride home, so Daniel offered to help. According to his story, they went to his house, where they drank and engaged in consensual intimate intercourse. But then, an argument erupted between the two, and Daniel claimed he can't remember the cause of it. The situation escalated to the point where Daniel, in a fit of rage, grabbed a heavy wooden cutting board and struck Tanya on the head. Realizing she had died, he panicked. Daniel took her body to the location where it would later be discovered and left it there. On his way back, he disposed of her belongings and returned home. When asked about the dog hairs found on the victim's clothes and towel, he explained that his roommate had a black Labrador and those hairs were indeed black. Daniel's story sounded like an attempt to minimize his own responsibility. It was hard to believe that Konya willingly engaged in consensual sex with him, only to have such a severe argument minutes later that led to her death. He also claimed that she died after the blow to the head. However, medical experts had undeniable evidence that the cause of death was strangulation. A more plausible scenario would be that Daniel attempted to assault Tanya and she resisted. He then struck her on the head but quickly realized she was still alive, leading him to strangle her. Despite the fact that the suspect's confession probably didn't align with the actual events, the detectives had everything they needed. Daniel was arrested on charges of murder and placed in custody. Right after that, investigators contacted Tanya's relatives, including her son, to deliver the long-awaited news. Timothy couldn't hold back his tears and thanked the police for finally finding his mother's killer. However, Daniel wasn't destined to face a judge and serve time for his actions. Just 2 weeks after his arrest, his lifeless body was discovered in his cell. The examination indicated that he had taken his own life. Tanya's relatives were disappointed by the fact that the murderer had escaped the prospect of spending decades behind bars. Nevertheless, in the end, they found some closure in knowing that, after 35 long years, the case was finally solved. Alright guys, share your thoughts on the story in the comments section and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a girl who went for a walk and disappeared under strange circumstances. What happened next shocked everyone with unexpected twists and chilling discoveries. This case became one of the most perplexing in American history, but in the end, detectives managed to uncover the truth. Christy Lynn Mullins was born on August 28, 1960 in Columbus, Ohio. She grew up in a large family with 5 children. They all lived in a quiet neighborhood away from the hustle and bustle of the city. In the summer of 1975, when Christy was 14, she spent most of her time hanging out with her friends and her sisters. Their favorite spot was the pool at the nearby residential complex, especially on hot summer days. Sometimes she also worked as a babysitter, looking after the kids of people she knew. On August 22nd, one of them asked Christy to watch her child until late in the evening. The next day, Christy woke up around noon and began pondering what to do. With her birthday just 5 days away, she was eagerly anticipating it, so time seemed to pass very slowly for her. The day turned out to be extremely hot, with temperatures soaring up to 93 degrees. So, Christy quickly decided that going to the pool would be the best way to spend time and cool off. She brought along her younger sister Kim and they headed to the residential complex. Kim went straight into the water while Christy opted to lounge on a deck chair. A few moments later, she was approached by her friend and after a brief chat, they both left. Kim was surprised that her sister left her alone without saying anything, but decided not to follow her and stay at the pool. Sometime later, Kim headed home, but her sister wasn't there. After a few hours passed without Christy showing up, Kim started to worry. She decided to walk around the streets to look for her and soon ran into one of the neighbors. He said that about an hour ago, the police had found a girl's body a few miles away, but couldn't identify her. Kim rushed home and told her parents about it, who immediately called the police, explaining that they couldn't find their daughter. They were instructed to come to the morgue, where officers showed them the body of the deceased girl. At first, the parents couldn't tell if it was their daughter because of the extensive bruises covering her face. But soon, the mother noticed a birthmark on the girl's leg and realized it was Christy. Once her identity was established, the police informed the shocked family about what had happened. Around 2:30 p.m., a man called 911 to report finding a human body in the wooded area behind the shopping center. He, along with his wife and son, went there to buy a toy for their daughter. However, before the family went into the shopping center, their son said he wanted to take a walk in the wooded area behind the building. There was a well-known trail among the trees that led to the river, and overall, the place was quite picturesque, so people often went there just for walks. His parents agreed, and they walked along this path into the depths of the forest. As the family was coming back, they noticed something strange happening a few yards off the trail. Upon closer inspection, they saw a man on the ground, leaning over someone and striking them with a piece of wood. The man saw them, got up, and fled. The father approached the spot and discovered a girl on the ground, covered in blood. His wife, who was undergoing medical training, tried to find a pulse on the victim, but was unable to find one. The man ran to the shopping center and called the police from one of the stores. He and his wife provided investigators with a description of the perpetrator. He was a young, tall, slender man, around 20 years old, with long dark hair down to his shoulders. He was wearing only jean shorts and boots. Based on their description, the police created a sketch of the suspect and distributed it to patrol officers. The crime scene examination yielded no results. Officers found the piece of wood used as the murder weapon, but they couldn't find anything that could lead them to the perpetrator. It's worth noting that the victim's hands were tied with a telephone cord and her bikini top was pulled down. The t-shirt she was wearing that day was found next to the body, along with her shoes. Despite this, forensic experts didn't find evidence of sexual assault. Investigators speculated that the perpetrator intended to assault her, but something scared him off. Despite the lack of leads, the police quickly realized which direction to focus on. Christie's younger sister revealed that she left the pool with her friend named Carol, so the police went to talk to her. Carol said that on that day, an unknown man called her home, claiming to be a DJ from a local radio station. He said there would be a cheerleading competition in their town and the winners would get free tickets to the state fair. The caller claimed that the event would take place behind the shopping center and would start at 1:45 p.m. He told her to wait at the entrance to the trail in the woods, where someone would meet her and explain everything. Obviously, this story seemed very suspicious to the police, but there were even more odd details. Carol claimed that initially she decided to go to this event with her sister, but halfway there, they ran into Christie and her sister. After a brief chat, Carol invited Christie to go with her, so they left the sisters behind and headed towards the shopping center. The girls arrived at the entrance to the woods and waited, sitting on the fence, but no one showed up. Sometime later, Carol said she would go to the shopping center to ask for the time. It took only a few minutes, but when she returned, Christie was no longer there. She waited for a while, but no one appeared, so eventually she left. The police found no evidence to support the claim of any cheerleading competitions in town. They assumed that the caller could have been the killer attempting to lure Carol into the woods, or it could have been some prank unrelated to the murder. Either way, they couldn't trace the call, making it impossible to identify the caller. Investigators also noticed a discrepancy in Carol's story. She said she met Christie and her sister on the street while walking to the shopping center. However, Kim insisted that they were at the pool and Carol came to them there. But that's not all. Late that same evening, Christie's mother encountered Carol, who lived just a few dozen yards from their home, and they had a rather strange conversation. Carol began apologizing to the woman and said that things weren't supposed to go this far. She added that she was supposed to be the target and that 2 people were involved in the murder. Shocked, Christie's mother tried to get more details, but Carol refused to continue the conversation and left. The woman reported this to the police, and they spoke with Carol again, but she claimed she hadn't said anything like that and insisted on the truthfulness of her initial version. Later, she was questioned again with a polygraph, and the operator didn't detect any signs of deception in response to key questions. After this, investigators shifted their focus away from Carol and continued searching for other leads. In the following days, as news of the brutal murder spread throughout the city, local residents were gripped by widespread fear, realizing that a dangerous criminal was still at large. The situation was worsened by another fact. The police believed the killer was a local resident, as they knew about the trail behind the shopping center. Detectives deployed all their resources to find the culprit, and 3 days after Christie's murder, there was a long-awaited breakthrough in the case. Around 5 p.m., a police officer was patrolling the center streets of Columbus when he spotted a man who remarkably resembled the sketch of Christie's killer. The patrol officers immediately contacted the detectives, who quickly arrived at the scene. They asked the man to go with them to the station to answer a few questions, and he agreed. He turned out to be 25-year-old Jack Carman. Despite the fact that he voluntarily agreed to answer their questions, the police immediately faced a problem. The man had a significant intellectual disability. His IQ, according to various tests, was estimated to be around 50 points. Jack was under the care of a specialized medical institution and lived in an apartment provided by a non-profit organization where he worked. He couldn't read, write, and spoke poorly. But the detectives on Christie's case couldn't ignore the striking resemblance between him and the composite sketch. The interrogation proved to be very difficult. Most of the time, Jack answered the detectives' questions with a single word or just remained silent. They also began to doubt whether he was even fully capable of understanding and grasping the meaning of their questions. The interrogation stretched out for 6 hours, but eventually, the detectives began to make some progress. By asking the most simple and concrete questions possible, they were able to extract the long-awaited confession from Jack. According to his words, on that day, he left his apartment and took a bus to the shopping center to buy himself pants and a shirt. As he walked through the parking lot towards the entrance, he noticed Christy sitting on the fence near the beginning of the trail leading into the woods. He approached the girl, grabbed her, tied her hands, and dragged her into the woods where he assaulted her. After that, Christy tried to escape, and that's when Jack caught up with her, grabbed a piece of wood from the ground, and struck her multiple times on the head. Then, he ran to the main road in front of the shopping center and jumped on a bus. The next day, the police took him to the forest and Jack pointed out the spot where he committed the crime. He also provided investigators with details that only the perpetrator could know, such as the fact that the piece of wood broke in half when he struck the victim with it. The detectives also lined up several people, including Jack, and asked the couple who found Christy to identify the person they saw that day. Both pointed to Jack. He was charged with several offenses, including assault and murder. Despite the fact that experts didn't find any evidence of sexual assault, Jack confessed to it, so the prosecution decided not to exclude it. The prosecutors sought the death penalty, but Jack's lawyer, with his consent, struck a deal. Jack had to admit his guilt before the judge and receive a life sentence instead of execution. Considering that thousands of people were following this case, everything happened very quickly. On September 3rd, just 11 days after the murder, Jack was sentenced to life imprisonment. But after the trial, many people began to doubt Jack's guilt. The more details about his confession and the man himself emerged in the media, the more people began to wonder, could he really have done something like this? Those who knew Jack initially didn't believe it. According to them, he never showed any signs of aggression. He was quite passive, timid, and compliant. He would tell any lie if someone demanded it firmly enough. For example, once at a charity center, he took the blame for a broken boiler, even though someone else had done it. There were also doubts about Jack's ability to confess to the crime. He could barely speak, yet the police claimed that he had told them about the crime in utmost detail. Those who knew Jack believed that the investigators had simply fed him all the necessary information. They just needed to ask leading questions that already contained facts about the case. For example, did he strike the victim with a piece of wood? And if Jack answered yes, the police could already use it as a confession. One woman who was involved in Jack's treatment added that under threat, he could confess to anything. It was enough for him to hear that he faced the electric chair and he would do whatever the detectives asked. But that's not all. Supporters of Jack's innocence found out that the police had brought him to the murder scene at the same time as the witnesses, the same married couple who later identified him among other people at the police station. So, they had already seen Jack and knew that he was a suspect. The police had claimed that the witnesses didn't cross paths with Jack, but no one believed it. There were many more facts that raised strong doubts about Jack's involvement. For example, the police couldn't find the bus driver or even a single passenger who saw Jack on the way to the city center. According to his own confession, that's how he got home. But the most significant factor was the testimony of several people in the charity organization building where Jack lived and worked. They claimed to have seen him around 1:30 p.m. If he was indeed there, he had absolutely no chance of taking a bus to the shopping center on the outskirts of the city and committing the murder by 1:50 p.m. Even if he had left immediately after being seen by the witnesses, the bus would take at least 40 minutes to cover that distance. All these facts made many people not just doubt Jack's guilt, but come to the conclusion that police had essentially coerced his confession. Even Christy's parents started to doubt that he was the real killer. On September 9th, just 6 days after the verdict, around 70 people gathered in front of the city hall to draw attention to the case and demand a thorough investigation. They formed a public committee with the goal of seeking justice. Thanks to this, Jack found a new lawyer who quickly filed for a case review. Several months later, a judge revoked Jack's confession and ordered a new trial. Now, the prosecution had to prove his guilt practically from scratch, which seemed like an almost impossible task. While preparations for the new trial were underway, Christie's father, Norman Mills, conducted his own investigation. From the beginning, he didn't believe the detectives, thinking they weren't doing enough to find his daughter's killer. Eventually, he decided not to rely on the police and started searching for answers himself. Soon after the murder, he and some neighbors went to the woods to inspect the area. There, they found jean shorts and blood-stained men's underwear. They handed these items over to the police, who had initially just overlooked them. However, it remained unknown whether these items were linked to the case or even tested. The new trial for Jack began only in 1977, 2 years after the murder. The defense had two tasks. First and foremost, to prove Jack's innocence and also to try to identify the real killer. In fact, they already had a pretty strong candidate for this role whom they considered the most likely suspect. The man who found Christie's body with his wife. His name was Henry Newell, and at the time of the murder, he was 25 years old. By the start of the trial, Jack's lawyers had gathered an impressive list of reasons to suspect Henry for the murder, and during the trial, this list grew even longer. Initially, Henry drew attention because of his criminal record. Starting from his teenage years, he had been arrested numerous times for various offenses, serving 3 prison terms. He had successfully escaped from jail twice before being caught and sent back. At the time of Jack's trial, he was serving his 4th sentence. This time, Henry had set his own house on fire to collect insurance money. The lawyers had also reviewed the evidence from Christie's case and found several very suspicious details. In his testimony, Henry said he found her body, ran up to it, and tossed aside a blood-stained piece of wood. He explained this by saying he was in a state of shock at the time, but such an action still seemed odd. Why would he pick up the murder weapon and throw it away from the body without any apparent reason? He also claimed he thought the girl was still alive, so he took off his shirt and pressed it to her face. This action also raised questions. Did he really try to stop the bleeding, or did his shirt get bloody during the murder and he needed to justify it somehow? Jack's lawyers found a store employee in the mall where Henry ran to call the police. She said he wasn't wearing a shirt but had jean shorts on, although by the time the police arrived, he was already wearing different pants. The employee also claimed Henry had a fresh bruise on his face as if someone had hit him. When asked why she didn't immediately tell the police about this, she said no one simply asked her. The officers themselves should have noticed this bruise, but they ignored it. Back then, Henry also agreed to take a polygraph test, but he ended up vomiting right on the machine, so the police didn't arrange a new test. Another witness was Henry's neighbor. He said that on the night of the murder, he spoke with Henry and noticed many fresh scratches on his hands. The man also mentioned seeing a telephone cord in Henry's garage of the same color and shape as the one used to tie the victim's hands. But that's not all. The neighbor stated that Henry once told him a very strange story. He claimed to know Carol, Christie's 14-year-old friend, and that they used to swim naked together in the pool. Considering he was 25 at the time, this story shocked everyone involved in the case. However, finding any direct evidence that this actually happened was simply impossible. Yet, it indicated that Henry was acquainted with Carol, who also had a direct connection to the case. His wife, Pam, also testified in court. She said everything had happened exactly as they told the police on the first day. They went to the mall and their son wanted to take a walk. They went to the woods and found the body. Pam added that up until that point, Henry had been at home and only stepped out for a few minutes to chase away the neighborhood kids who had started throwing firecrackers into their yard. Carol also testified. She stated that she had never met Henry. She was also asked about what she had meant when she told the victim's mother that things shouldn't have escalated so far. But Carol once again claimed she didn't remember saying anything like that. Henry himself was also brought into the courtroom from prison. He repeated his story without any changes and insisted that he had nothing to do with the crime. One of the most significant moments of the trial was the display of the full recording of Jack's interrogation. After viewing it, it became apparent to everyone that Jack was simply coerced into confirming the detective's words that he had committed the murder. Jack barely spoke and apparently didn't fully understand what the police wanted from him. But that wasn't the most crucial moment of the trial. On the 5th day, another unexpected witness appeared, neither anticipated by the prosecution nor Jack's lawyers. It was Bobby, Henry's stepson, and his testimony truly shocked everyone following the case. The boy revealed that on that day, Henry did indeed leave the house to chase away kids throwing firecrackers in their yard. However, he was gone for more than just a few minutes as his mother had claimed, but for over half an hour. When Henry returned home, his shirt and sandals were missing and he had scratches on his arms and face. Henry called Pam into another room where they had a conversation. After that, they came out and told Bobby that they were all going to the shopping center. Upon arriving, the parents immediately led him to the trail behind the shopping center. The boy claimed that he hadn't asked to go there for a walk, as his parents had initially stated. They entered the woods and almost immediately found Henry's sandals, one of which was torn. A little further, they saw Christy's body, and his mother instructed Bobby never to tell anyone about what he saw. The boy added that he only decided to tell the truth after having a conversation with his biological father, who had convinced him to do the right thing. His grandmother also testified in court and recounted one strange episode involving Henry. She, along with him and Pam, attended Christy's farewell ceremony. On the way back, the woman said what a tragic it was, and Henry suddenly replied, "It will teach her to keep her mouth shut." Another witness was Henry's friend. He said that Henry once confessed to him that he killed Christy. He added that the killing was accidental, not planned. In the end, this trial left practically no doubt that Jack had no involvement in the crime. And eventually, all charges against him were dropped. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite the overwhelming evidence pointing to Henry's involvement, the prosecutor stated that he had no intention of pursuing a case against him. He also noted that the initial investigation was conducted in the best possible way. However, the prosecutor pointed out that the police either failed to notice or ignored a vast amount of clues and evidence available to them from day one. His response sparked a wave of public outrage. It reached such heights that 2 days later, the prosecutor had to backtrack and agree to reopen the investigation into Christy's case. But here was a serious problem. Investigators relied on the initial investigation, including the testimonies of Henry and Pam. In other words, the police still operated under the assumption that the couple stumbled upon Christy's body in the woods with a long-haired, shirtless man looming over her. For this reason, investigators stated that they would be looking for new suspects resembling Jack. Of course, such an approach yielded no results. The investigation continued for several months, and eventually, this case went cold. Christy's father never gave up on seeking justice. Once, he filed a civil lawsuit against Jack, but the reasons for such a move were not as simple as it might have seemed. The man didn't believe in Jack's involvement in the murder, but this legal process would have granted him access to the case files, giving him the opportunity to collect all the available information. Unfortunately, this also yielded no results. In 2006, Christy's father passed away from cancer, never having closure in the case. For a long time, there was no progress in the investigation of Christy's murder until 2013, when former attorney John Aller took an interest in the case. He decided to conduct his own investigation, reaching out to all involved parties, hoping to find new leads. Christy's relatives handed him a box containing all of her father's records, which he had been gathering up until his death. Aller went through them all, spoke to dozens of people, and it became evident to him that the culprit behind this murder was none other than Henry. During his investigation, he found out that Christy's friend, Carol, was into smoking marijuana at the time. Digging deeper, he uncovered something else and concluded that she, like some other teenagers, apparently was buying it from Henry. This became another link between him and Carol and could indicate the real reason why the girl went to that forest. He theorized that the whole story about the DJ was simply made up and in reality Carol arranged to meet Henry in the forest to buy the illegal substance. Perhaps she decided to invite Christy along under some other pretext, such as using the same story about the DJ and cheerleading competition. Another much darker version suggested that Carol may have initially lured Christy there at Henry's request, who had planned to assault her. However, the girl fought back as evidenced by the scratches and bruises on his body, and the man killed her. Delving deeper into the case, Aller discovered that by that time, Henry had committed even more crimes, including arson, domestic violence, and assault. There was another incident linked to him, but he wasn't tried for it. The death of his wife, Pam. In 1982, she filed for divorce, and just a month later, she was found dead in their apartment where she still lived with Henry. The official cause of death was a sleeping pill overdose, and the police found a note indicating that she did it herself. Pam's relatives didn't believe this version and suspected that Henry had tampered with the pills. The strangest part of this whole story was that no package of sleeping pills was found in the apartment, even though Pam obviously couldn't have disposed of it after taking such a large amount. That same year, 2013, when Aller took on the case, Henry passed away from cancer at the age of 63. Despite this, Aller continued his work and released a book containing all available information about Christie's murder. The release of the book sparked a new wave of interest in the case, and Christie's relatives, along with other people, began demanding to reopen the investigation. Several of Henry's relatives also reached out to Aller, stating that their entire family knew that he was the one who killed the girl, but kept silent. One of them recounted that a few months before her 16th birthday, Henry had given her a car as a gift. They went for a ride together, and at some point he asked her to stop, looked at her, and said that he had killed Christie, detailing the crime in full. The woman said she couldn't believe it. According to her, Henry had been drinking a lot and she thought he had simply made up this story under the influence of alcohol. However, after reading Aller's book, everything fell into place for her. All of this led to the reopening of the murder investigation in May of 2014. For many months, detectives re-examined all the available evidence, interviewed dozens of people, and re-evaluated the leads. In his confession to his relative, Henry mentioned that he had assaulted Christie. At the time, medical experts found no evidence of that. But now, with modern technology, they re-examined Christie's clothing and found traces of semen. Unfortunately, the traces were so small that conducting DNA analysis was simply impossible. The investigation continued until the end of 2015, when detectives called a press conference. 40 years after the murder, they finally announced that they have no doubt that Henry was the one who committed it. However, since he was no longer alive, they couldn't take this case to court. It was officially declared solved and the investigation was closed. Without Henry's confession, investigators couldn't be 100% sure of exactly what had happened. But they had a strong idea. Most likely, when Henry had left home that day, he went to the trail behind the shopping center. Perhaps Carol invited him there so she could buy weed. But that part cannot be confirmed. Once there, he saw Christie alone and decided to assault her. He tied her hands with a phone cord and took her further into the woods where she fought back. Christie managed to scratch him and hit him in the face, after which Henry likely knocked her down and killed her with a piece of wood he had found nearby. He then returned home, told his wife what had happened, and they both came up with a plan how he could avoid punishment. It's worth mentioning that Carol never told the truth after all these years. It's possible she was somehow involved, and we can't exclude that one day she'll come forward. During the press conference, the police also apologized to Christie's family for how negligently their predecessors handled the case. There was enough evidence from the beginning to charge Henry with the murder, but the investigators either didn't notice it or simply ignored it.